Gracious Heavenly Father, thank you so much for my brothers and sisters and opportunity to meet together because of our relationship with you as our Father. And just what an awesome thought it is that you, the one who spoke the world into existence, the Lord God Almighty, and yet you're still our Father. We have a relationship with you and you love us. And we're overwhelmed by that. We're grateful. We want to be good children. We want to know you better. We want to know ourselves better. We want to understand the world that we live in. And we want to be able to make the most of the time that you give us. And I pray that we'd be better equipped to do all those things as a result of studying your word together tonight. That's my request in Jesus' name.
Amen.
All right. We are in Acts, the 16th chapter. Acts chapter 16 is second missionary journey. We find ourselves in Philippi. Philippi is always, I don't know, just seemed very special to me simply because reading the book of Philippians. You know, the book of Philippians is only 4 chapters long, and yet there's more written about joy and contentment in all situations. I've learned how to be content. I've learned the secret when I've had excess. I've learned the secret when I've had nothing. But I learned this ability to be... Well, he's telling that to the church of Philippi. And it's very upbeat, very positive, and he writes it while he's in prison. And the thing that fascinates me about that is in recent years, I didn't know this, but in recent years, we've learned a lot more about the prisons of the first century, and especially in the Roman Empire. And in all likelihood, Paul was probably in something we would think more of as a dungeon, more of as a hole in the ground. Mm-hmm. And what they would do with their prisons would, to make it worse, and I don't mean to gross anybody out, but the sewer system would actually run right into from the streets, right into that dungeon. And so he would frequently be in chains. In fact, he mentions he was in chains and be in this area where the only opening would be towards the street where sewage and everything else is coming down into the pit in the ground where you are. And he writes more about joy and contentment in that kind of situation to the church at Philippi. Well, the church at Philippi is also the only church, he so states, it's the only church that he received support, financial support from his entire ministry. Other churches, I think there's some wisdom to be gained in this, not just talking about finances, but wisdom in dealing with people, which includes sometimes finances, right? But wisdom in dealing with people. The church at Philippi, he would always receive support from. The church at Corinth, he says, in essence, no way am I going to let you ever support me. That's a little overstatement. But the point he was making is, if I took an offering from you guys, you would misunderstand it. You would think, well, you know, he's only doing this for the money. Or you would think, well, we paid him, he ought to say what we want him to say, or whatever. And he said, since you, in so many words, he's saying, since you guys can't handle it, I'm not going to take none of my salary is coming from you. I'm taking my salary from these guys over here. Why does that impress me so much? Just on a personal level, it impresses me so much because Philippi is the one place where it seems like there's no Jewish influence. Yeah. It seems like there was no synagogue in Philippi. And so instead of people knowing a little bit about God, these people probably had polytheistic background from the Roman Empire and probably started from ground zero. And it just reminds me, get a little personal here, you can disagree with me if you want, but sometimes it's easier talking to somebody who doesn't know anything about the Lord than somebody who's been all goofed up in some strange church and been taught things wrong, right? Sometimes there's different cults and church backgrounds that just go all over the map, and sometimes there's a lot of untraining that has to be done before training. Anyway, the church at the second missionary journey, the church is established at Philippi, and this is where it's established. There are 3 main characters that we meet in the 16th chapter. Who's the first? First 2 are women. The first one is, what's her name? Lydia. And she's not from Philippi, but she's got a house in Philippi. You've known those kind of people, right? They've got a house there, and they've got a house there, and they've got a house there. Those are what do we call them? We call them rich people. She's probably a rich person. She's probably, what's her hometown? Thyatira. Thyatira. Where else do we read about Thyatira in the New Testament?
Revelation.
In the book of Revelation. Jesus' letter to the church of Thyatira. That's exactly right. Okay, which, by the way, the letter of the church of Thyatira also deals with a woman. But this one's not a good woman. We use it. It's probably not a real name, but he calls her a nickname.
Jezebel.
That Jezebel you've got in the church there. Which, by the way, I'm glad we don't have any Jezebels in the church. Anyway.
I hope people don't name their kid that. I mean, that's really wrong.
Okay, so we go back to the 16th chapter of the book of Acts, and we've got this first lady, Lydia, and she's first convert that we know about in the city there, and she's helping with the people meeting at her house, right? Okay. While they're going down to the river to pray, because that's where they first met Lydia, on one of the many trips down there, though, we find that somebody else is following Paul and Silas and dogging their path everywhere they go. And it's a young girl. What's this young girl doing?
She's actually gives future references, and for them, she keeps down, they are from God, listen to them.
Yes, they're telling a way of salvation and everything. And what does Paul think about that?
He gets irritated.
Okay, this is interesting to me too. If somebody's saying, hey, these guys are really from God, they're telling a way of salvation, wouldn't you say, yeah, that's right, let me pay you $5 for, why doesn't he like that?
I think it's the source.
I think it's the source too. I totally agree with you. Because if somebody has demonic possession and as a result of demonic influence is saying something in your favor, I don't think you want to be associated with that. And so what does Paul do?
He exorcises the demon.
Yeah, there you go. And once the demon has left the girl, she's owned, by the way. She's a slave girl. The owners of the slave girl automatically see, put them in their pocketbook. Right? Once their means of making extra money through this girl. And so what do?
They go complain to the government of that town or something.
That's exactly right. The government officials. And the government officials, instead of due process, they turn to the crowd and pretty much let the crowd beat them with rods first, and then they have them thrown into jail. This is where we meet the third character, and I think this is where we left off last week, right?
Yes.
Verse 25.
Verse 25?
I think so.
Yes.
Okay, very good. So they've been beaten with rods. Paul already mentioned that when he's reviewing all the things that happened to him as an apostle over in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. It's one of the things that had happened to him, and we know about the background of that from reading about it here in Acts chapter 16. Okay, I think I mentioned last week we left off at the end of verse 24 when they put their feet in stocks. This is not, from everything we know about the way they used to do their prisons, this is not I grew up watching some Westerns. The Rifleman, that was one of the shows I watched and stuff like that. And in the old Westerns on TV, when somebody got in trouble, they had this wooden thing with 3 holes in it. And they'd open it up and you'd put your head here and your 2 hands there. And so that's what always comes to my mind with stocks. If that's what comes to your mind, then you, like me, need to get that out of our mind, because that's not what we're talking about. It's not just what we know historically, but also the Greek word used implies a contortion of the body. So these were some sort of devices that they were chained in, fastened to, that would put them in a position where they would be in pain, right? To me, that adds weight to what we know about prison. Well, what I told you earlier about prison, that was in Rome. We have some good detail about how bad it was there. We don't know exactly what the prisons were like here, but I seriously doubt that they would be much better. But in prison, in fact, he's in the inner part of the prison, and the two of them, and they're in these devices which would be painful. I think that's important to remind ourselves before we read the rest of the story. Let's see what happens. Verse 25 Let's have verses 25 through 28.
About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once all the prison doors flew open, and everyone's chains came loose. The jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself. We are all here."
I just so love this whole story, but I love this part of the story.
Yeah.
What are they doing when they're in this contorted, painful contraption inside this prison when in all likelihood, how'd they get there in the first place? False charges. Due process has not been being followed here. They were beaten with rods before they were put in here. There's a really good chance that they could be killed. Okay? Really good chance that they could be killed. Another quick reminder. Prison system in the first century in the Roman Empire. As I understand this, there were no such things as prison sentences. It wasn't like, oh, you're guilty, you're going to be in prison for 5 years. No, prison was more like jail today. Prison was just a place they held you until they decided, we're going to kill him, we're going to let him go. Or we're going to, sometimes it wasn't kill, we're going to beat you and then let you go. But it wasn't prison sentences, right? There weren't prison sentences. So when you're sitting in prison after being beaten with rods in a torturous device, one of the real thoughts that go through your head is, yep, in the morning we may be dead. So with that background, what are these guys doing?
Praying and singing.
Hey,
Singing praises.
yeah, how about Amazing Grace? Start us off. Yeah. I love that. Where's their mind?
On the Lord.
Yeah. Big picture here. Sometimes you just get so focused on the circumstances that you're in. I think they've got every excuse to be focused on the circumstances that they're in.
You know, Mark?
But they still didn't lose the vision of
Sounds
what's
like-
really going on.
It's the place I'm supposed to be. You need to bring that up.
Okay, yes. Yeah, I was telling the guys last night, I listened to the testimony of an Iranian preacher who was caught smuggling Bibles into Iran. And this was at the airport in Iran. Took him into a back room, strapped him in a chair, started torturing him.
Yeah.
Wanted him to recant his Christianity and re-avow his commitment to Muhammad and Islam. Mm-hmm. And so what they were doing, I don't know everything else they were doing, just part of the story I remember is they took a brick and they were breaking his kneecaps.
Oh my God.
And while they were breaking his kneecaps, he looked at the brick because they were telling him, recant your Christianity. And his response was, if I said Jesus wasn't God, that brick is going to start saying Jesus is God. Because even the stones will cry out. But his testimony was, this is where I need to be. And when I heard him say that, I'm like, honestly, if I were there, I'd be thinking, God, how long is this going to last? Because I really need to be somewhere else other than sitting in this chair having somebody break my kneecaps. But he's thinking of this is where a Christian needs to be, standing up for God. And I'm so humbled when I hear things like that. So here are these guys singing hymns. Okay, not necessarily hymns of praise, although that's a possibility. But they're singing hymns. The main point is they're focused on God. Because God's still God even when you're in a prison. Right? And there's a bigger picture here, even when we're in the worst part of life. This is only a blip on the screen in eternity's perspective, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes, in fact, God warns us more than once. Jesus said they treated me this way, and boy, how did they treat him? They're going to treat you that way, which, by the way, one of the passages we dealt with at the men's study last night, in fact, we're not there yet. We're right at the place where Jesus is coming into Jerusalem at the end of his earthly ministry. And one of the Psalms that they're quoting is Psalm 118. The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. That's not the part that they're quoting there. They're quoting, Hosanna, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, as Jesus is coming in. But it's from a psalm that says, the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Okay, that's over in 1 Peter chapter 2. Exact same passage, Psalm 118. And it's talking about Jesus. And the neat thing about it is, right, the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. In other words, the very people who should have accepted Jesus rejected him. But he's become the foundational stone. If you don't stand on Jesus, you don't stand a chance, right? He is the only way to God. Well, here's the way it says it in Psalm 118, and the way it's quoted in 1 Peter chapter 2. The stone of foundation, the chief cornerstone, has become the capstone as well, is also the same stone causes people to stumble and die. So a stone can be either something you stand on, build your house on, or the exact same stone trip you up, and it's not a normal fall. It's a fall where you die. Right? So on Jesus you stand or fall. Why am I bringing that up now? Because in 1 Peter chapter 2, it says, you too, Christian, are stones. And these stones are being built up into a spiritual house. So we can honor God. And I automatically, every time I read that, I automatically go to, yeah, we're built on the foundation of Jesus, and we're supposed to be bringing other people. And that's true. But the transition he makes is, hey, Jesus was rejected, accepted by some, but rejected by a lot. But, by the way, you're a stone too. And I think the flavor there is, before we go on and talk about how we're supposed to be built up, be prepared. Because some people are going to accept you. A lot of people aren't. Going to trip right over you. But when they trip over you, they kick you in the process. Right? So, I mean, that's what they did to Jesus. That's obviously what's happening to Paul and Silas here. So they're going through this awful time, but they keep their focus on God. They're singing hymn to him. And what's everybody else doing in the prison while they're doing this?
Listening.
Can we just chew on this for just a second? In the worst times of your life, somebody's watching. In fact, I would guess somebody's watching that you don't know is watching. Right? These people are listening. One of the people I think is listening is the jailer.
Oh, yeah.
How in the world can these guys, right? Okay, so they're singing hymns to God. That's obviously the only noise going on. And people are listening. And then there's an earthquake. It's not a normal earthquake. How do you know it's not a normal earthquake?
Opens up the doors and
yes. Yeah, I've not seen earthquakes yet that open up handcuffs and the chains. However, they're in these contraptions. The contraptions come off and the doors go wide open. So this is obviously a God thing, right? Okay. As a result of that, what does the jailer want to do? Why does he want to kill himself?
He's responsible for all those prisoners.
Thank you. We already saw this back in chapter 8 when Herod interrogated the guards who were supposed to be watching Peter. Yep. When, by the way, an earthquake. Not an earthquake. This is
an angel.
The angel came, kicked him in the side, got him out. But the doors opened up on that occasion, right? And they get him out. Well, what happened to the guards? Herod interrogated him, killed him. Because you're responsible. If you lose your prisoner, it's your life in the place, right?
Yes.
Okay, so he's ready to kill himself. And what does Paul shout at him?
We're here.
Don't argue. Okay.
We're still
Okay.
there.
Here's the part that always gets me. 20 seconds ago, you guys faced death, and it was like, amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a person. And you're ready to go. This guy's ready to kill himself, and it's like, no! What's the difference here?
He's not going.
Because Paul and Silas are ready.
Yes.
He's not ready. Right?
Yeah.
That's the thing that got me in that story about the guys in Thousand Oaks, California, when the shooter came in. That one guy who saved so many people's lives. I know where I'm going. So he could keep going back in there and getting people out and stuff. That kid was in his 20s. Wow. I just love that. Stuff like that. Anyway, so obviously he's not ready yet. So let's just have verse 29 and 30.
The jailer called for lights, rushed in, and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He then brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?"
Okay, I just really love this at so many levels. It says, when it talks about here, first of all, he falls trembling. Okay, if you go back up, what did he do? Let me see. They handed him over to the jailer. Look back up at verse 23. After they were severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. Right? That was his command. What did he do with them? Put them in torturous devices. He wasn't commanded to do that. So he's the one who is partially responsible for the terrible mistreatment. So now that a miracle has happened, with trembling, he comes to these guys. What's the question he asks?
What must we do to be saved?
What must I do to be saved? Okay. Again, I want to simmer on this for just a minute. What in the world does he mean by being saved? Do you think he was asking, I don't want to go to hell, I want to go to heaven? I'll tell you what, I don't think he was asking that. Because I don't think he knew about heaven and hell.
Survive this earthquake.
Yeah. But what do you think he meant when he said, what must I do to be saved?
Want what they have, because he can see. Yeah.
I keep coming back to that. We're in a community where most people didn't know about God, not the one true God. Polytheistic background. There wasn't enough God influence there to even have one synagogue in this massive city. It was known for a hotspot for retired military people to go to. So this would be an area, this jailer may have been formerly in the Roman army. And this was a lucrative way to finish out his years as a jailer in Philippi. Probably, I'm speculating there, but that's the background we know about the city. But no religious influence as far as from Jews or Christians yet. This Christianity comes first time. And what do they see in Christianity? They see people who have a calmness about them when they face their death. I'm thinking in so many words, the jailer saying, oh, I wish I had that. Whatever you've got, I wish I had that. Yeah.
I also think he linked the earthquake with what they were saying.
How could you not? How could you not? Because it's kind of like, earthquakes don't do that. This is so you've got this obvious hope or peace that they've got, and you've got an obvious supernatural element to this. And we do have, I shouldn't have said that he doesn't believe in heaven and hell. He doesn't believe in the heaven and hell of the Bible. But there's such a universal, in so many of the different polytheistic and pagan religions, there's a lot of afterlife taught. And most of it's not good, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't think he wanted the despair. We're going to see this in the next chapter, in chapter 17. Both the Stoics and the Epicureans that we're going to meet there, neither one of them had a strong belief in the afterlife. They were like materialists are today, that once you die, that's it. So there was despair. There was nothing to live for beyond this life. But other than some of those philosophies, a lot of the religions of the ancient world did have some sort of belief in the afterlife, but it usually wasn't good. And so, especially a guy like this who's been mistreating people and stuff, if he had the scales idea, get what you deserve, karma idea that's prevalent in so much of the world, he probably would be thinking, it's not looking good for me, mm-hmm. right? But at whatever level, he sees something there, and he sees the supernatural element. I'm glad you pointed that out, too. And he wants that. He wants things to be good. So he asks this question. So, let's have verses 31 through 34.
They replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all the others in his house. At that hour of the night, the jailer took them and washed their wounds. Then immediately he and all his family were baptized. The jailer brought them into his house and set a meal before them. He was filled with joy because he had come to believe in God, he and his whole family.
Yes, okay, so the first verse you read back in verse 31, it says believe. And then in the last verse that you read there in verse 34, it said his whole family believed, but they were also all baptized. Okay, I simply want to state that because this is one of the passages that people turn to and say, that's why you should baptize babies, because obviously in this household he had somebody who was a baby, and my response would be, well, no, that's not obvious. I know a lot of households who don't have babies. Number two, everybody in his household believed, right? So that's the big thing. And when you're old enough to believe, you are old enough to be baptized, right? But there has to be a belief. If it's not an act of faith, you just got somebody wet. Okay, other than that, that's not the main point here, but it is an example of somebody becoming a Christian, and their baptism is associated with that. Notice, he washed them, they washed him. Mm-hmm. He washed their wounds, they washed him in baptism, brought him into the family of God, right? After that, what does a jailer do? Brought him into his house, into a Gentile's house. And what do they do when they come in the house?
Feed them.
What's the significance of having a meal together?
Endorsing
Yeah,
his family.
that was huge. This was not one of those nice things where it's kind of like, let me buy you a hot dog. You must be hungry, feel sorry for you, or whatever. In the ancient world, to eat with somebody was a big deal because it was a matter of association, fellowship. It was a matter of saying, this person's like family to me. Well, guess what? He is part of the same family now, right? Sure. Part of the Christian family. So I think that's kind of neat. Okay, he washed them, they washed him. He feeds them. One of the commentators I was reading said, I bet you anything at that meal they stopped and had communion. So he fed them and they fed him. Mm-hmm. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but it used to be a practice in a lot of churches when somebody would get baptized, even if it was not on Sunday morning, it was Sunday night or some other time, they'd have communion service right afterwards because they get to take communion for the first time. I mean, you can eat the bread and drink the juice beforehand, but it's not communion until you're a Christian. Once you're a Christian, that has extra significance to it. So anyway, I just find that kind of interesting. So we have some other converts here. He's the third major character. The character that we meet in this chapter at Philippi would be the jailer. So that's happened. Let's have verses 35 and 36.
When it was daylight, the magistrates sent their officers to the jailer with the order, release those men. The jailer told Paul, the magistrates have ordered that you and Silas be released. Now you can leave. Go in peace.
Okay. Couple interesting things here that honestly I hadn't thought about before. When he comes back in the morning and says you can release these guys, is he going to say, well, they're in my guest room over here? We've actually been eating together and everything. Or after they ate together, did he put them back in jail? Might have. And you know what? Paul and Silas probably said, that's okay. Go ahead and put us back in jail.
Just not in the stocks.
Because you never ordered to put us in the stocks in the first place. Right. Either way, the order comes down that they can be released. Okay, as far as we know, the magistrates don't know what happened the night before. That was at midnight, right? Which is another, I think, very significant thing, because at midnight, it wasn't like turn the lights on and come in. No, we didn't have lights back then. At midnight, usually you waited till morning to do anything else, unless it was just an emergency. But at midnight, they baptized them. Why not wait till morning? Because we may not be here in the morning.
You don't know if he's...
Yeah, but it's the same point Jesus makes in Luke, the 17th chapter. If you don't know when the Lord's coming, then whatever you're going to do for the Lord, you better do it right now. If it's for the Lord, it's not something that should be put off. There's so many parts of the story I just love. Okay, so they give the order that he can be released. And so notice how they respond. Verse 37.
But Paul said to the officers, they beat us publicly without a trial, even though we are Roman citizens, and threw us into prison. And now do they want to get rid of us quietly? No, Let them come themselves and escort us out.
Okay. What bomb did he just drop?
Roman citizens.
This
Whoops.
is huge. In fact, if just to make the impact here, put your finger here and flip over a couple pages over to chapter 22. Chapter 22, because it comes out even a little stronger, I think, over in chapter 22. Chapter 22, if you're with me, I'm going to start reading in verse 25. Chapter 22, verse 25. As they stretched him out to flog him, it's kind of like every place Paul goes. He's going to get beaten with rods or flogged or thrown stones on him or whatever. Anyway, as they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "This man is a Roman citizen." The commander went to Paul and asked him, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes, I am," he answered. Then the commander said, "I had to pay a lot of money to become a citizen, but I was born." It says, anyway, you get the flavor of this. It's not just the centurion, commander of 100. It's his commander, got the general. Yeah. General runs down and is like, "Stop everything." What? This is a Roman citizen? We almost beat him. You're not allowed to do that. Why is Philippi concerned about this? Because Philippi could lose their special status with Rome. Right. This could cause the whole city. One commentator I read said, it's not that they just lose their status. Rome liked to make an example out of places. There's the real possibility that if they mishandled a Roman citizen, Rome wouldn't have sent a delegation, they wouldn't have sent letters, they would have sent their army and leveled the place. That was a real possibility. So since Rome handled things that way, when they found out that they mishandled a Roman citizen, it's like panic. Yes.
Well, I love the next part. He says, "But I was born a citizen," and then it says, "Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately." It's like, whoops, that just scared them all out of the room.
Yes, I love it. Okay, so let's come back. I've got to ask this question. Why didn't he play that trump card earlier? No. Maybe because this is where I need to be. I'm humbled. I don't think at that level. But Paul was more than willing to go to play. In fact, we're going to find out later when he's going back to Jerusalem. And Agabus comes and says, "Don't you know you're going to die there? Or you're going to be put in prison there?" And Paul says, "You're breaking my heart." In other words, I know. And I'm on my way. Stop it. Paul's more than willing to walk into these things because there was something more important to him. Right? He can see the big picture. He sees what he's doing for God. He can see eternity. Man, I just love this. So let's have verses 38 through the end of the chapter.
The officers reported this to the magistrates, and when they heard that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens, they were alarmed. They came to appease them and escorted them from the prison, requesting them to leave the city. After Paul and Silas came out of the prison, they went to Lydia's house, where they met with the brothers and sisters and encouraged them. Then they left.
Okay. Did you notice you can go now? Would you please leave? Right? There's a transition there, but I just see this as very smart strategy, because it's not like they're flaunting their citizenship, because they would have done that earlier if they wanted to avoid problems, right? They willingly went through the problems, but now, instead of leaving town, they're going to use that leverage to say, "Don't mess with the Christians here." So they go back and they encourage Lydia and they encourage everybody else. And then they leave. And I'm just guessing that the magistrates and everybody else are kind of like, "Lydia, you're okay, right?" Right? Well, you guys know we're trying to be nice to Paul and Silas, right? So when they left town, they're probably on good terms, or trying to be on good terms with the Christians there, which is a wonderful thing.
Is that the first time we see that Silas is a Roman citizen?
It's the first time I remember it. I don't know if it mentions it before, but yes, it does mention they're both Roman citizens. So yeah, good point. Good point. Okay, so from there we're going to pass through a couple very impressive cities and end up in Thessalonica, which is really interesting. In fact, let's go ahead and have the first chapter 17. Let's just have the first two verses. Let's just have the first two verses, and we'll make a couple comments here.
When they had passed through Amphipolis and Paphlagonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As his custom was, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures.
Okay, he's back to his standard operating procedures. He goes to a city. The first thing he does is he looks for sin. Well, I don't think I should say he's back. He's always used this approach. And the only reason he didn't go to a synagogue in Philippi is there wasn't a synagogue. And so he went to the next place where they thought he might find some people praying, because there weren't enough people there to actually have a synagogue. And he did find some people praying down by the water. So in this case, though, the interesting thing here is we pass through two more impressive cities and get to the third city, which was Thessalonica was not only an important port city, it still is today. And that's not always the case. Cities don't always last that long. Sometimes when they, for various reasons, they move and relocate. But this is still an important port city today. But even though it's a significant city, the reason I mention this is, why is Luke skipping over some things? I don't think he's skipping over anything. I think he's just focusing on what's really important. It's not the size of the city. It's the number of converts. It's the ability to start a church. It's the spread of the gospel, right? And so if we don't have reception, and we're going to see that some places the reception's better, other places it's bad. But we're going to focus on how it's progressing. And it progresses at Thessalonica. Thessalonica, just want to emphasize this, in verse 2, it says they're there for 3 Sabbath days. This really impresses me, because we're going to have a church started in 3 weeks, right? They're going to be run out of town. Paul is anyway. Some of them are going to stay behind. They're going to come back and they're going to encourage them later. But can you start a church in 3 weeks? Well, they did. They did. So I would call this, I mean, no disrespect by this at all, but I call it a baby church. Because, I mean, brand new, right? Yeah. I keep that in mind when I go and read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are very interesting, by the way, in a lot of different ways. But number one, it's either 1st and 2nd Thessalonians or Galatians are the earliest letters we've got as far as chronology goes. So there's some of the very first letters written. Well, that makes sense to me, because if I'm going to, it's not easy to write a letter in the 1st century. It's not easy to get it to somebody, right? But who are you going to be most concerned about? I'm guessing not the people who are well established. I'm guessing the people who were only there 3 weeks. Let's make sure they're doing okay, right? And some extra emphasis there. If you read, especially 1 Thessalonians, the first letter that he sends, Paul keeps talking about, I was like a nursing mother with her baby. I was like a father to you. He uses all this terminology where he just kind of oozes this, tender compassion. And again, it brings to mind, there's a prophecy about Jesus that says, a bruised reed he will not break, a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. And it's talking about his compassion to the down and outers, to the sinners and the tax collectors, and how he's compassionate to them. And yet, the religious leaders, Jesus was like, you don't want me to do that on Sabbath? Okay, I'm going to do it on Sabbath. And you scribes, Pharisees, you hypocrites. When you make somebody one of your disciples, they're twice a child of hell that they were before. He's just right in their face, confrontational to some people, but he's extremely gentle with others. Apostle Paul, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, that's about as lovey-dovey as you're ever going to see the Apostle Paul. But to the churches in Galatia,
No.
that's about as
Corinthians.
brutal as you're ever going to see the Apostle Paul. He's says some really graphic things that I can't say in this company. I'll just let you read the book of Galatians for yourself. He gets pretty strong with them. Okay, so we've got this. Here he is in Thessalonica. They reason with him for 3 Sabbath days, right? 3 Saturdays, their services. What's the kind of response they give? Let's get verses 3 and 4. 3, 4, and 5.
I'll back up a few words so it makes sense.
Okay.
He reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I'm proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. But the other Jews were jealous, so they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out into the crowd.
Okay, and we're going to continue with the story for a minute. But the first part of that 5th verse, some people believed, other people didn't. Other people didn't. So we get this polarizing effect again, right? In pretty strong difference between two of them. Okay, I'm glad you backed up a few words before you started reading verse 3, because he's explaining to them, we're in the synagogue, we're talking to Jewish people, have Jewish background, and he's trying to explain to them that the Messiah has to do what? Suffer. Okay. What was their conception? What was their idea? This promised Messiah who's coming from God. When they pictured the Messiah, what they usually focus on, what they picture?
King that would take over.
Oh, warrior king who's going to conquer all their enemies. Okay, are there any prophecies that present the Messiah as a warrior king? Yeah. But there's also Isaiah 53, Zechariah 12, 2 of the passages, especially Isaiah chapter 53, that pictures suffering, despised and rejected by men, one from whom people hide their face. God heaped upon him the iniquity of us all. Well, they're called suffering servant passages, right? Okay. You know, the Jews in Jesus' day had such problems with that, they thought that can't be the Messiah. Maybe there's 2 Messiahs. Maybe we got our warrior king, and maybe there's another one that's going to come along and suffer. They had all sorts of ideas that were convoluted because they couldn't bring those thoughts together, right? Okay. I know this is kind of weird, but I've been thinking about this all day long after reading about this. Einstein has this famous saying. I've heard it represented in a couple different ways. But he's famous for saying everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. You remember that saying? Should make everything as simple as possible, but not simpler. Sometimes, I really appreciate this, because to make things simple, don't make it more difficult than it has to be, but don't you dare make it more simple than it should be. You can make it too simple. That's exactly what they did with the concept of the Messiah. They couldn't bring it all together, so they just focused on the part they wanted to focus on. And when you only focus on part of the truth, you don't have the truth. You don't have the whole picture. That's exactly what's going on here. So what's Paul doing? He's trying to explain to them that the Messiah, they understood the Messiah. They're all looking forward to the Messiah. Right. But he had to suffer. That's part of the picture they didn't want to focus on. You don't have the whole picture of the Messiah until you get the whole picture. Right? So he proves that. And rise from the dead. Suffer and rise from the dead. So suffering involves death, and he had to rise from the dead. And Jesus fulfills all of that. Right? But if he fulfills all of that, then that means the conquering side doesn't fit their picture. Okay, rising from the dead, that would be conquering, but that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for somebody to take care of these Romans. Right? So again, it doesn't fit their picture. So some people respond from the evidence, but others don't. Now, verse 5, the Jews that didn't respond, tell me the motive.
Jealousy, like always.
Yeah. Wait, doesn't this make you think of the very first missionary journey, Antioch, Pisidia? They go there, and people are like, man, that was good. That was great. Until next week, everybody shows up, and it's kind of like, well, I don't think I like it anymore. Right? Because the crowds are too big now. Right? So there's another motive going on here. This It's just one of the many verses in the Bible that reminds me, when people say they don't believe, there's a reason they don't believe. Much of the time, people want to say, well, I don't believe the facts. That's not really the case. There's something else going on. I think I already told you this. Josh McDowell, did I already tell you about this? Josh McDowell, he wrote the book Evidence That Demands a Verdict, which back when I was in Bible college, that was like such an impressive book as far as Christian evidences go. Very well written because he was a college professor at the time. He was trained in law. And that's why Evidence That Demands a Verdict, it sounds like a lawyer making a case. And that's exactly what he did in that book. He wrote several other books after that fact. Anyway, he, as a professor, as an intellectual, was going to do the world a favor and prove that Christianity was false. And the more he got into it, the more evidence that he looked at. It's kind of like evidence that demands a verdict, and he became a Christian in the process of trying to disprove this. Okay. I've known that since the 1970s when the book first came out, and I read it and stuff like that. What I didn't know till this year was Josh McDowell told his story, the reason he didn't believe. He told everybody because, in his adulthood, he told everybody because it's a bunch of nonsense. Reasonable, rational people wouldn't believe things like this. And that's why he went into his studies and eventually became a Christian himself. That's what he said. But the real reason was because in his childhood, he was abused. And he was abused by people that he associated with the church. In other words, he didn't want it to be true. That is, I don't always mean abuse, but what I do mean is it's almost always the case there's something else going on, and usually it's at an emotional level. And people convince themselves, no, at an intellectual level, I don't believe this. A lot of times you don't believe what you don't want to believe, right? There's a definitely a tie there, and I see this with these Jews here, because it's not like, well, we don't agree with that. No, they're jealous. Jealous of what?
Well, they're jealous of the popularity and
okay, in Antioch of Pisidia, the whole town comes out. Here we don't know how many people, but obviously they're having some sort of impact.
Yes.
And whatever that impact is, or their ability to explain Scripture maybe, because obviously he's reasoning from the Scripture to prove, he's proving a point. They're jealous of something, but it's the jealousy that really motivates them. By the way, why did the Jewish leaders, Pilate saw right through the Jewish leaders when they made accusations against Jesus, and he knew what really motivated them. What motivated them?
jealousy.
Envy, jealousy.
Yeah,
that's
envy,
exactly
right.
right. Because the crowds were following him. Yeah, and Pilate knew it. He knew it. But he still went along with it. But, yeah. Okay, so they're jealous, and so they get this mob going. And why do they go to Jason's house?
They go to get both of them.
Yeah, they go to Jason's house because they're looking for Paul and Silas.
Yeah.
But Paul and Silas are at McDonald's now. they're not at Jason's house.
No.
Well, that's okay. You're associated with them. We're going to beat you up. Right? And so that's what's going to happen. Let's have verses 6 through 9.
And when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying there is another king, one called Jesus." When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. Then they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go.
Yeah. Okay, so Jason, just by association, is in trouble. But Paul and Silas we're going to find out what happens to them in just a minute. But they're not, they've been scrutinized many times, but they're away. But other Christians other believers who are turning to Christ are getting in trouble because the mob, right? Okay, the charges that they bring up against them in verse 7. What are the charges?
Turning the world upside down.
Okay, that'd be back in verse 6. But in verse 7, the legal charges are
defying Caesar's decrees.
Oh, yeah.
saying
There's another king.
another king. What were the charges they brought against Jesus?
Yeah, same.
Saying he was another.
Same thing. Same thing. That's right.
You're no friend of Caesar's. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. Which, by the way, who's making these charges?
Yeah.
The Jews. The Jews. Did
No.
they recognize Caesar as king?
No. Only when convenient.
Yeah. Only when it's politically convenient. That's exactly right. Again, I don't want to overstate anything here, but this reminds me, did you know that Islam teaches that you are allowed to lie to people who are not Islamic?
Right.
And that's okay?
Yes.
I don't know what the Jewish rabbis were teaching in the first century, but it's as though the Jews were more than happy to lie about stuff just so they can get their way.
But do
And
you
their
know
way
that-
taught that you're not supposed to lie. Right?
Do you know that only 3% of the Muslims and things like that actually understand?
Oh, I'm not surprised at all. I'm not surprised at all because this is important in studying world religions.
Yeah.
When people talk about, they pray 5 times, it's not 5 times a day.
Yeah, fuck.
Yeah.
Is it 5 times?
Uh-huh.
Okay, they pray 5 times a day. My immediate response is, you do know that's not the kind of prayer that you and I are talking about. We talk about prayer, we're talking about talking to God. And there's all types of prayer. There's confession, thanksgiving, there's praise. In Islam, that's not what you're doing. You're reciting something that most of the time you don't even know what you're saying. You're repeating something 5 times a day. It's a ritual at a ritualistic level. And a lot of religions are that way. But there's word theft going on. Maybe not intentional, but we need to be aware of the fact they're not using the same terms the way we are. They don't mean the same thing. Man, I wish I had time to tell you. I listened to a lecture this past week where this guy was making the point that otherwise very intelligent scientists do this all the time today. And they're pulling the wool over a lot of people's eyes. Maybe not intentionally. But they use the word chance. What does the word chance mean?
Probability.
It's mathematical probability.
Exactly.
Okay, and my favorite example of this is there's a preacher I know, his name's Jeff Fall, George Fall's son. He was over in Europe. Why was he in Europe? Because he was going to the Holy Land, had a layover in Europe. Layover was going to be all day long before evening so he can catch his flight going down to Tel Aviv or wherever it is for his Holy Land trip. So there he is in Europe. He's in an area of Europe where they offered these, hey, you're stuck at the airport for the next 8 hours. You can get on this bus, you can go see some of the cathedrals in town. So yeah, a few bucks, let's get on the bus, let's go see. So he's in a cathedral, in the basement of a cathedral with less than a dozen other people, and he looks over and there's a guy from 10 miles down the road back home in Indiana in the basement of a cathedral in Europe.
Right.
Thousands of miles away.
What are the odds?
You call that a chance meeting. Because what are the mathematical probabilities that somebody 10 miles down the road, you're going to meet him with just a dozen people in a basement in a cathedral, halfway around the world on this particular day? Chances are really low. Okay, follow me. The mathematical probability may be remote, but that doesn't mean there weren't causes. It doesn't mean there weren't reasons. In fact, there were a lot of causes and a lot of reasons that brought about that chance occurrence. Why? Because he's on his way to the Holy Land. He got on a certain flight. He paid a certain amount of money. There's all sorts of plans and all sorts of reasons for that to happen. Chance does not mean there aren't causes. There are a lot of causes that bring about events. Right. And yet, secular astrophysicists will tell us today that space plus time plus chance equals the universe. That's what they say. Here's logically what that means. Nothing plus nothing plus nothing equals everything. That's what they're logically saying. Because they've redefined the word chance. I mean, there's nothing there. But it exploded into existence. And the question would be, What exploded into existence? Well, everything did. Well, what was it before it exploded? Sorry, I'm so sorry.
So that's because nobody's asking the questions.
Say what?
Nobody's pushing back to ask the questions.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm so sorry. It's just fresh in my mind because I watched that recently. But this whole idea that sometimes there's words being used, and we always have to ask ourselves the question: do we understand the way they're using that word? Do we mean the same thing, like with prayer or with anything else that somebody's talking about? Okay, we've got just a couple more minutes left. Let's get Berea in here before we leave. They go from Thessalonica to Berea, verses 10 through 12.
As soon as it was night, the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. On arriving there, they went to the Jewish synagogue. Now, the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if Paul said what was true. As a result, many of them believed, as did also a number of prominent Greek women and many Greek men.
Okay, they have a terrific impact in Berea. In fact, they're not going to get into trouble until people from Thessalonica come and show up. Right? The Jews from Thessalonica they're going to mess things up. But look back at verse 10. How did they get here?
In the night, sneaking.
Yes, yes.
Sneaking out.
Yes, they're sneaking out in the middle of the night. The believers sent Paul and Silas to Berea to get them out of town. Okay, this is not how they left Philippi at all, right? They wanted to strengthen the church there. I again see a lot of wisdom here personally, because it seems to me there's a time where you need to take a stand and do things publicly, and there's other times where it's kind of like, you know what, you just need to get out of here. You're only going to make matters worse. You need to leave town, and we'll take care of things. We're actually going to see a couple situations too. We're going to see it next week, where sometimes it's not everybody who needs to leave town. It's just Paul.
Yeah.
Because, sorry, Paul, but you push everybody's buttons. Right? So we're going to let Silas stay. We're going to let Timothy stay. But Paul, you need to get out of town. I think there's some wisdom to that too. I think we need to ask ourselves, and we do this sometimes. A lot of times we do this. It's kind of like, you know what? We're not going to let Mark talk to him. We're going to ask Jack to go talk to him. Or something. You look at the person, you look at their the qualities of the person, or maybe you look at the people they're talking to, right? Because some people can relate to people better than other people can, and that's part of the wisdom of, because what's the goal here? Goal here is not to win arguments. Goal here is to bring people closer to Jesus. And so whatever way we can do that, sometimes taking a stand, other times not you, we'll let somebody else do it, right? And so that's what we're doing, and that's how they end up at Berea. And we are out of time, but I do want to make this point. Why are they of more noble character? Which, by the way, this is kind of it is a compliment, but it's also really an insult to the Jews at Thessalonica, because he's not saying that they did good. No, what he's saying is they're just a higher class of people. He really is saying something. Which, by the way, back with the magistrates in Philippi, again, I don't always think this way. I have to be reminded. When they took their stand, instead of leaving town, this was not just a taking a stand for the church. This was, in that culture, this was a shaming of the magistrates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was a hang your head low, dog with the tail between the legs, that kind of thing.
Pro.
So this was kind of a shaming of the Jews in Thessalonica, and it's also a commending and a compliment of the Jews in Berea, because they actually checked it out.
Right.
Which, by the way, best thing you can ever do.
Right.
Best thing you can ever do. It's kind of like, okay, really like that preacher. I'm going to go check him out. Or that sermon, or that lesson, or whatever. Go check them out. Make sure it's in the Scripture. And I think it's commendable. Okay, and so they have a great response. We'll talk about this next week.